He wasn't stealing. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there by the yogurt aisle, hoodie up, phone out, waiting for a suspect. But to the wrong pair of eyes, he was a threat. And to the right ones, he was justice in disguise. The harsh overhead lights buzzed in the stillness of the refrigerated section. Marketplace wasn't particularly crowded that afternoon, but there was the usual shuffle of carts, the clink of milk bottles, the tired sighs of after-work parents amid the routine. Noah Lattimore stood still. Hoodie pulled up, jeans slightly worn at the knee, a plain black tee under the zip. On his wrist, a slim smartband flickered silently. In his hand, a phone with no text, just a time-stamped map overlay. He wasn't here for groceries. Noah was 33, an FBI agent for over a decade, and openly gay since his academy years, though he'd learned early on that visibility came at a price. For this operation, he had been trailing a woman named Teresa Mendez, suspected of laundering nearly $1 million through fraudulent EBT transactions. They had tracked her to this grocery store, a known handoff point. Noah was in position, his posture casual, but his nerves tuned razor-sharp beneath the silence. Teresa was expected to meet a contact near the dairy section, then drop a key envelope into a reusable shopping bag. Noah had positioned himself next to the Greek yogurt, facing the low, humming refrigerators, pretending to scroll through his phone. Every muscle in his body was still, trained, waiting. Then came the sound of boots, heavy, decided, off rhythm with the usual shoppers. He didn't need to look up to know what kind of man made that sound. Officer Grant Merrill, a patrolman for the local precinct, had noticed him from the end of the aisle, a white man in his late 30s, barrel-chested and sun-creased. The type who didn't like to be questioned, especially not by people like Noah, and certainly not in public. Grant saw a man in a hoodie standing still, eyes scanning, alone by the yogurt aisle. To him, that was enough. The officer approached without greeting, without a glance at Noah's hands, without even a second to assess the surroundings. The badge on his chest might have glinted in the harsh light, but what truly gleamed was certainty, the kind that doesn't ask questions, just assumes answers. Noah's back tensed. He knew this wasn't going to be a question and answer exchange. It would be a test of control and timing. But the moment Grant said, "What are you doing here?" loud enough to turn a few heads, Noah knew Teresa would hear it too. And if she was anywhere nearby, she'd be gone within seconds. Still, Noah didn't flinch. He raised his eyes, slow, measured, and calmly answered. Waiting for someone? Grant stepped closer. ID. Noah reached into his hoodie pocket, not for his wallet, but for the badge tucked inside a slim leather case. He flipped it open. FBI. There was no dramatic flourish, just the truth, offered without fear. But the officer didn't move. His lip curled just slightly, enough for Noah to recognize the disbelief. The kind that said, You got proof that's real," Grant said. "Or should I take you down to the station?" A mother 2 aisles away paused with a jar of baby food in her hand. Someone else pulled out a phone. Noah's voice stayed even. "You're interfering with a federal operation." But Grant didn't care, because all he could see was a man in a hoodie who looked too soft, too quiet, too gay to be law enforcement. Not the kind he respected, not the kind he feared. And just like that, months of investigation balanced on the edge of one man's prejudice. What the officer didn't know was that another agent was already inside the store. Riley Monroe, sharp-eyed, calm as glass, blending in near the end cap of cereals, and she was watching everything. And still, Noah stayed still. Still like dignity. Still like strategy. He knew how this worked. He had lived this before. Because sometimes, being a federal agent wasn't enough. Not when your skin was too pale, your voice too soft, or your hoodie too worn. Not when you were gay and standing in the wrong aisle at the wrong time. And yet, he waited. Because this mission wasn't just about stopping crime. It was about proving that who you are shouldn't be the first thing someone fears. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can wear is visibility. If you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, if you've ever been judged by how you look, who you love, or simply where you stand, subscribe to Heart Story. Because we don't just tell stories, we uncover truth. The moment stretched like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. Officer Grant Merrill took a step closer, one hand hovering near his utility belt, not an alarm, but in authority. He didn't raise his voice, but it had that sharpness that said he wasn't here to listen. Noah Lattimore didn't blink. The FBI badge was still open in his hand, clearly marked, federal seal intact, nameplate gleaming under the overhead light. But Grant didn't reach for it. He didn't scan it. He didn't care. His eyes were locked not on the badge but on the man holding it. People had started to notice. A woman paused at the end of the aisle, frozen between indecision and discomfort. A younger man near the dairy coolers subtly lifted his phone. Not quite filming, but ready. Grant's words dropped like a rock into the shallow silence. This could be fake. We'll verify it back at the station. Noah's jaw clenched. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Not in the field. Not when he was this close to a suspect. Because any sound, any movement could trigger panic. But the damage was done. Teresa Mendez had already noticed. From the corner of his vision, Noah spotted her, the woman in the oversized beige sweater with a floral scarf casually slipping past the granola bars. Her pace quickened, her cart abandoned. A faint click from a Bluetooth earpiece and she was gone. Into the crowd, into the parking lot, and into the wind. Noah closed his badge and slowly put it back inside his hoodie. Not defeated, but focused. Then came the sound of footsteps, measured, decisive. From the opposite aisle emerged a woman in dark jeans, blazer, and black boots. She walked without hesitation, her face calm, unreadable. Riley Monroe, also FBI. Same clearance level as Noah, and the only person in the room with more power than Officer Merrill in that moment. She didn't raise her voice either. She simply stopped beside Noah, pulled out her own badge and a laminated folder, and held it directly in front of Grant's face. Agent Riley Monroe, FBI. You've just compromised a 6-month investigation. Grant's expression flickered. Just for a second. Not fear, but the start of realization, Riley continued. We had eyes on a suspect connected to a $900,000 EBT fraud ring. That suspect is now gone. Because you decided that a man standing still in a hoodie was more dangerous than the woman walking out the door with our evidence. Grant opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to deflect. But Riley didn't give him the chance. You never asked for ID verification. You ignored federal credentials. You interrupted an operation because of your instinct. The word was cold, dismantling. Around them, more phones were out now. A quiet ripple of recording screens and wide eyes. The dynamic had flipped, and Grant felt it. I'm not here to argue, Riley added. But your actions will be included in our report to your department's internal affairs. Your chief will be informed, and your badge number is already noted. Grant's face turned a shade paler. He nodded stiffly, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. It settled into his posture like guilt slowly turning into shame. Noah, still silent, looked down the aisle where Teresa had disappeared. The chance was gone. No arrest today, no handoff intercepted. Months of building a web cut loose by one moment of unchecked assumption. And yet, he didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Because people had seen, phones had captured, the narrative had shifted. Later, the video would be clipped, subtitled, and shared. A federal agent, calm and composed, being doubted not because of what he did, but because of how he looked and who he was. But in that grocery aisle, what lingered most wasn't the failed operation. It was the truth left hanging in the air. That sometimes those sworn to serve and protect fall victim not to lack of training, but to layers of bias they never thought to question. And the cost of those blind spots, $900,000, and a woman now gone. But the deeper cost, the one nobody calculated, was trust. Trust lost in broad daylight, under fluorescent lights, next to rows of yogurt cups and assumptions disguised as instincts. The scent of sour milk lingered faintly in the air as shoppers began to scatter. The commotion was over. Teresa Mendez had slipped away into the anonymity of the street, and the aftermath hung heavy between the three of them. Officer Grant Merrill hadn't moved much, his feet still square on the tile floor, his hand now dropped from his belt. But his eyes shifted. Not in power, not in control, just in something more human, something closer to discomfort. I was just following protocol, he muttered under his breath, almost too low to matter. Sometimes you get a gut feeling. Riley Monroe's arms remained folded across her chest. Her posture was still, Not confrontational, but not forgiving either. Instinct, she repeated, isn't supposed to be built on bias. Noah Lattimore stood silent beside her. His eyes remained fixed on the store entrance, as if willing Teresa to turn back around, to give them a second chance. But he knew better. There would be no second chance. What they had spent 6 months constructing surveillance, tracing payments, staking out transfer points had unraveled in under 2 minutes. Not because of a lack of evidence or flawed planning, but because of one man's unwillingness to listen, to look beyond a hoodie and a soft voice. The ripple effect was already underway. By nightfall, the footage had spread across social media platforms, the confrontation, the badge being dismissed, the slow, calm exposure of the mistake. All of it was now playing on phones in offices, schools, even squad cars. And Noah, whether he wanted it or not, was being labeled the man who taught the cop a lesson without saying a word. It wasn't a badge of honor. It wasn't vindication. It was exhaustion wrapped in unwanted visibility. Back at the bureau, the assistant director ordered a review of the operation. There were no reprimands, just regret. Teresa was a high-value target, connected to multiple fraud cells, and now she was gone. Internal Affairs at the local police department launched a preliminary inquiry. Grant Merrill was requested to submit a written account. He was removed from active patrol for the time being. It wasn't a suspension, but it wasn't nothing. The department's chief called Noah directly that evening. A short, clipped apology, the kind that acknowledged embarrassment more than accountability. Still, it was something. But Noah didn't need the calls, or the viral praise, or the shallow apologies. What haunted him wasn't just the lost suspect. It was the familiarity of it all. This wasn't new. This wasn't a rare fluke. It was part of a pattern he had seen unfold over and over again. Unchecked assumptions, split-second decisions rooted in discomfort, the wrong face in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when someone like him, an agent, trained, credentialed, proven, was still mistaken for a threat, simply because of how he dressed, how he stood, or who he loved, then what did that mean for those with no badge at all in the quiet of his apartment? Noah rewatched the clip, not out of pride, but to understand what others saw. His stillness, his calm, the badge, the rejection of it, Riley's voice. The moment Grant hesitated, he watched it not as himself, but as someone trying to learn what went wrong. Because that's the part people rarely talk about. Bias doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It masks itself as instinct, as gut feeling, as doing your job. But real instinct, the kind that saves lives, that solves cases, that protects and serves, comes from clarity, not assumption. It comes from knowing when to step forward and when to step back, when to ask and when to listen. And most of all, it comes from choosing to see people as more than just shadows beneath hoodies. Noah didn't need to teach a lesson that day. The damage had already done that. The hum of the highway played like a soft static through the windshield as Noah Lattimore sat in the passenger seat of the bureau-issued SUV. The dashboard clock ticked quietly beside the low buzz of Riley Monroe's earpiece, now turned off. The mission was over. The weight of failure pressed down, silent but unmistakable. Riley drove without speaking. She didn't need to fill the silence. She understood it. Sometimes, silence wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space to process what had just happened. Space to carry disappointment with dignity. Noah's hands were clasped in his lap. His fingers still shook faintly, though not from fear. It wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken, profiled, dismissed, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. As they pulled into a rest stop to file initial post-incident notes, Riley finally spoke, her voice soft yet direct. That cop, he didn't even blink before deciding what you were. Noah nodded once, but his gaze didn't shift from the dashboard. And then, slowly, his voice emerged. When I was 17, I got punched in the face by a uniformed officer. I was at a bus stop, holding my boyfriend's hand. We weren't kissing. We weren't loud, just holding hands. He said I was provoking people. Broke my nose. Told me I'd thank him someday for scaring me straight. The SUV stayed quiet. Riley's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, but she said nothing. Noah's voice didn't shake. It didn't harden either. It was just level, Live. I think about that night more than I should. Not because of the pain, but because I almost listened. I almost believed him. That being small or soft or open was a weakness, that I'd never belong anywhere if I stayed me. He leaned back, watching the sunset smear against the windshield like diluted flame. So why still do this, Riley asked. Finally, he smiled barely, but it was there. Because there are people who'll never be safe if all of us walk away. Riley glanced at him, the edge in her eyes softened. She understood that kind of answer, the kind that came from old wounds. They sat there for a while, the low sun casting long shadows across the lot. And just when it felt like the wait might stay for the rest of the day, a quiet knock tapped at the driver's side window. It was Officer Grant Merrill, not in uniform. Civilian clothes now wrinkled, buttoned down, sleeves rolled, his face lacked the usual certainty. This time, he didn't lead with words. He simply nodded once to Riley, then stepped to Noah's side. The two men didn't speak for a moment, just stood, an arm's length apart, in the fading amber light. Then Grant said, "I didn't recognize what I was choosing to see." Noah looked at him, not angry, not cold, just measured. He didn't offer forgiveness. That wasn't his to give. But he did speak, finally. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said. "You need to use your power to protect the people you used to profile." Grant nodded again, slower this time. And then he turned, walked back across the lot, and disappeared into the crowd of evening travelers. Noah didn't watch him go. He didn't need to. Because that moment wasn't about Grant. It wasn't about redemption. It wasn't even about closure. It was about the subtle shift that happens when someone finally sees clearly, not through policy or punishment, but through truth. And in that moment, what mattered wasn't the words exchanged. It was the space they created. A space where power could be redefined, where masculinity wasn't force, but choice, where justice wasn't a badge, but a presence, and where resilience didn't mean loud resistance, but choosing to show up again and again until the world learns to see differently. By the end of the week, the moment at the yogurt aisle had been seen over 3 million times. Clips circulated across every platform, some edited with dramatic music, others stitched into reels about justice and accountability. But one version stood apart. No flashy captions, no filters, just a clean, steady shot from a single phone. Angled low, slightly shaky, but intimate. It didn't just show the confrontation. It captured the silence, the stillness, the tension between what was seen and what was assumed. That version had come from a 17-year-old store clerk named Jaden. He wasn't supposed to be filming. He was restocking cereal 3 aisles over when he heard voices. Something in him, something deep, instinctual, told him to hit record. Maybe because he'd seen too many moments like that, unfolding too fast and too quietly for anyone to believe later. Jaden didn't know who Noah Lattimore was. He didn't know about the 6-month operation. He didn't know about the $900,000, or the name Teresa Mendez, or how close they'd come to breaking the case. All he knew was what he saw: a man in a hoodie being treated like a criminal for simply existing, and how that man didn't raise his voice, didn't panic, didn't retaliate, but still commanded the room. A few days later, Jaden sent the clip unedited to the FBI's General Inquiry inbox. But he didn't stop there. Attached to the email was a handwritten note, scanned and shaky, as if rewritten multiple times. It read, "I've never seen someone like me in this kind of role. Someone quiet, soft-spoken, who didn't shout to be heard but still made people listen. I get called names for how I talk, how I walk. People say I act too gay, too weird, too much. But watching him made me think maybe I'm not too much. Maybe the world's just not used to us yet. If he can be FBI, maybe I can survive high school." Noah read the letter in his office. The screen glowed dimly against the falling evening light. He didn't speak. He didn't move for a while. When he finally exhaled, it wasn't relief. It was recognition that someone, somewhere, had been watching. And not just watching the mistake, but witnessing the strength it took to stay still in the face of it. The Bureau's training division later requested permission to use the footage in their bias awareness program. They paired it with real testimony, Noah's voice layered beneath, narrating not just the incident, but the weight of what it meant to be visible and still questioned. The footage didn't arrest Teresa. It didn't rewind time, but it planted something else in awareness, a shift, a mirror held up to the kind of judgment that hides in plain sight. And Jaden, he started walking differently in the store, shoulders back, hoodie still on, but head a little higher. Sometimes resistance doesn't look like protest. Sometimes it looks like staying, like being seen, like refusing to shrink even when the world tells you to. And the question that still lingers, what do you see when a stranger in a hoodie stands quietly by the yogurt aisle? Threat or possibility? Let us know in the comments. And if stories like this move you, if you believe quiet strength deserves a louder voice, subscribe to Heart Story, because truth doesn't always shout, but it always deserves to be heard.